Overview of the art integration process, so hopefully suitable for the after lunch kind of slot here on how we integrated art into it, what some of the artistic concepts were and how they were built into the facade. Having said that, it's really nice always to have an opportunity to talk about the sort of massive team of people who are all pulling together to deliver this project on site, making the thousands of decisions every month over the last few years and presently in getting it built. Don't like the idea that there's this master hand guiding this process. There are hundreds and hundreds of people pulling on this project, some of whom are in this room today, and I just think it's good to acknowledge the collaborative process that's going on to deliver this project and make it a success. And talking a little bit about why the project looks the way it does and why it has this architectural outcome aesthetically and in its form and in its mass. There's a very deliberate attempt in the design process to make sure that architecture and structure are two horses pulling on the same chariot. So the form of the building expresses the structural responses to what are actually a very, very stringent set of functional requirements in the building. There's requirements for extremely large span, limited column numbers and open space, HVAC requirements and things like that. And by letting architecture and structure kind of work in unison in that respect, it's led us to this form and shape. And the example I have up on screen here is a P-51 Mustang designed in World War II. It was built in 102 days from the specification to the airframe. And we can only dream in our current procurement and design climate of acting that quickly. But I think it's a fantastic example of beautiful form coming out of solving extremely difficult functional requirements. Now around 2015, the design team was sort of challenged or provoked about how we could further integrate this idea of New Zealand identity into the project, and an art budget was assigned. So we always envisaged that these gestures would be completely integrated into the facade of the building and that it would form part of its identity, its visual identity. We're talking today about two components. We call it the spine wall, which is this terracotta-clad element on the right, and the level 5 glass-clad lantern, which is this element on the left. This was a kind of placeholder image we created at the time. We prepared a scoping document that talked about what the art could potentially do. And we were interested in how art on the building could integrate with and amplify the intent of the architecture, how it could delight and entertain, and how it can create and leave lasting impressions about place and experience and building identity. And our client, NZICC, they summarised this further by saying that it could be a powerful contemporary expression of Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, and Aotearoa, New Zealand's identity. There was a great quote that we looked at from Peata, the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, where Fiona Barker says that in New Zealand we have this strong, often emotional connection that New Zealanders have with the land, the beaches and ocean. And that was a real starting point for what the art could do, that it could be something experiential about what we see, touch and experience, light and colour and texture. And as we were starting to look at this idea as part of a building identity strategy and interior design strategy, we were interested in parts of the landscape that layer up, the way the sea is followed by the dunes, by the hills, by the mountains, and the way that forests have this layering and this veil. And that was a really informative part about what the art could potentially do from an experience point of view. Also the textures of craft and making that are very unique and particular to New Zealand. The weaving, the net, and this idea of veil and layer was very interesting to us. And like all good architects, we were looking at lots of art, Pat Hanley, and in this case lots of Ralph Hoteri from a Requiem series. Again, all playing with that idea of layers and overlaps and veils and how they can inform and mediate between what we see in and out of a building. Just quickly to give an outline of the massing strategy of the building and why it is shaped the way it is. A lot of convention centres, many of which you might be familiar with, particularly overseas in the larger scale, they're kind of ground scrapers. They're very large, often single-storey buildings. They have a nice glossy atrium and concourse out the front, and they have a lot of service needs around the side with kind of blank walls. They're often on the outskirts of cities where that kind of bad urban design outcome can be inflicted. We are on a completely inner city site, bounded on four sides by good pedestrian environments. So we couldn't do that. We had to stack the building up vertically. So we often talk about it as being New Zealand's tallest 3-storey building. Basically just has 3 major functional levels that you see here. The lowest level is coincident with Nelson Street and its sort of functional loading areas. The middle slice there is coincident with Hobson Street, and it needs to fill the entire footprint of that site at that point to meet the brief. And then the top level is the plenary level, which is level 5, which we talk about. And the public circulation occurs on the left side on the north, and the service circulation occurs on the right. This is just an example of that ground floor Hobson Street level and how wide and open and configurable it is. But probably more importantly, this is the level 5 plenary area. This is the space that's wrapped by the Sara Hughes artwork. So, it's a meeting place, it's an ideas place, it's where, provocative thoughts are put forward, people meet, people discuss ideas. And like a large pair of lungs, delegates move out of that plenary into the spaces each side, where they have their kind of closest experience with the city around them, looking through the glass and looking out to the environment beyond, and doing it all while looking through this art opportunity that we have wrapped around that level of the building. Here we are now. This is the monthly drone shot that Fletcher's take. This was taken last month. It looks almost exactly like the drawing, so we're delighted about that. It's completely asserting itself on the skyline now. It's been a long time coming, and we're very pleased to see it taking shape there. In the exhibition hall, this is the view out at Hobson Street, just to get a view of the scale and size of some of these spaces. But to talk more locally about where this art occurs, this is a view at level 5 taken last month. This is in the plenary level. This is a delegate pre-function space. So these are the spaces outside plenary, much like where you've been just now. And these are the spaces that delegates and visitors to the building will be gathering before and after functions, on arrival, or perhaps as they're about to leave the building, and they may be about to leave Auckland or even New Zealand. For many delegates, and you'll have some experience of this attending international conferences, sometimes the conference centre is perhaps your only experience of that city and of that country. So the way that the art and the building can have this ambassadorial role, or say something about what it's like to be specifically here in Tamaki Makaurau and here in New Zealand, was a very important part of the brief for how the art, what success would look like in the art. Just to look quickly at scoping what this is in these 2 opportunities. This is what we call the spine wall. This is a terracotta-clad rain screen wall. This is about 120 metres long. We're looking here at the TVNZ boundary, the north side of the site. You can see the stepped laneway, and this close hatched area is the extent of this terracotta. The tile people stall outside has a couple of these heavily profiled tiles that you can see out there. They're a 250mm module, they're approximately 1200 high, and there's 13,500 of them that wrap around this circulation spine. And just looking from the inside of the building back at that last section, that same extent, but like a cloak or a korowai, those terracotta tiles wrap round and back inside into the building. So the art opportunity there is this surface that forms a giant sort of adds, a giant sculptural element, but also runs all the way inside into the building. Looking at a section now with the 2 main streets each side, and the extents where the work by Sara sits on each side of the plenary in the pre-function space. These are those areas where delegates are looking out to the city, they're looking out to the Waitemata, they're looking out to the Waitakere Ranges, and they're looking at it through that veil. So we were very interested in what we could provoke as an art response there that works with the view, enhances the view, and becomes a very New Zealand and local and human and real experience. You just pull the section line back towards Wellesley Street, and we can see the extent of Sara Hughes's work. You can just see the beginnings of this being installed this week, and you can start to see it. This is a counterpart to the weight and the heft that happens in the terracotta wall, and that idea of the duality and the contrast and the way they can complement one another was an important part of the art brief and became an important part of how those artists started to respond to that. And just lastly, to kind of, again, you can see that heavily modelled section of the building. The terracotta sits here right against the laneway. That's a public open laneway, so there's opportunity where people will be up close to this, as well as the idea that the artworks are seen from several kilometres away, from the North Shore on the bridge approach and those sorts of views. And you can see Sara's work sitting down here. We were just looking at that north wall. So there's two artists working on this project. Sara Hughes is a colourist, would be how she'd describe herself. She's prominent. I think you would have seen much of her work before. She uses a lot of geometry, but her use of colour is what really distinguishes her. We've worked with her on the ANZ project. On the left there's a work called Orangery, where she used vinyl transfers on the glass and started to look at ideas of texture and light and what the New Zealand environment was like and what that experience would be like. And many of you might have seen her work Magma, a piece of which is shown on the right here. That's by Galbraith's Tavern and wraps around that giant water reservoir. So primarily a colourist, very interested in colour and boldness, but skilled in using layers, colour, storytelling, and particularly in working in big complex works at scale, which was very important on this project. Peata Larkin, another artist we have also worked for, and she has been exploring ideas of weaving and geometry. This is a work she did on the ANZ project also. It's a canvas where she pulls apart the threads and projects light through. So much of her work is interested in an aspect of craft, an aspect of traditional weaving and tuku panelling and ideas that evoke that, and also a very strong aspect of storytelling and geometry. So these artists were selected for this, and I think they're probably best placed to actually kind of talk about it. So I'll just show a quick video of those artists speaking about their reaction to that work.
Any artwork, it's really important to start with an authentic experience. And so when I was asked to create this work, I was asked to consider how could I convey a sense of being in New Zealand to international visitors and people that live in Auckland and in the wider New Zealand.
Several major aspects of the building's fabric which were identified as places where artists could later come in and layer their work, and the two primary areas for that were the terracotta spine wall, which stretches about 120 metres right through the entire block, and the other one is the kind of glass shroud which surrounds the top floor, which is the plenary hall.
So for me, I suppose I was thinking about how I could enhance the architecture, how could I play with the architecture. So then I thought, okay, there is this long wall, I want to soften it. And so my idea with the pattern was to make it like it was moving, you know, a moving pattern, an undulated pattern that gave you the sense of three-dimensionality, you know, in that flat surface.
I was already taken when the architect talked about the building being like a lighthouse that sits on the top, and so for me that feeling of then when you're at the bottom of the forest looking up through the trees and the canopy.
So delegates will enter and they won't forget, am I in Australia, am I in North America? No, I'm very much in New Zealand, and only could I have this experience in New Zealand. So I think a good example of the things that we're trying to do to make us stand out in the international marketplace.
So Sara was very interested in this idea of the leaf and the forest and the canopy, and I'll stress this is their work which I'm speaking on behalf of, so this is some of their concept work. She drew in her childhood in the far north and collecting leaves and watching how they change through the year, and this led to a wider look at all of the different kind of range of colour and texture found in the New Zealand landscape. And the idea of protecting and preserving those elements and sharing them with visitors and guests was very consistent with other objectives about the design of the centre, particularly the visitor and customer experience aspects. These ideas of kaitiakitanga and manaakitanga, of guardianship and hosting, respectively. And to cut what should be a much longer story short, this leaf motif was developed for her work on both the fins and on the south wall. These ideas of the endless pattern making and colour that was possible, that evokes what we see in our landscape, and the way it can change and shift in different lighting and weather conditions. And of course all of this has to be documented, and as architects, you know, we don't make recipes, we make blueprints. We put exactly where everything in the building is supposed to be with great millimetre accuracy. And there's some interesting differences in the way that Sara described her work for the building process and Peata described hers. For example, these are 7 different pattern types that, of which there's 49 fins that run down the east facade of the building and have just been installed. It's a print process onto the glass. It uses 60 different colours printed onto here, and these have to be provided as a high-res digital file, a vector file, so that can be printed onto the glass. Her south wall panel here, these are 230 unique panels. Every pattern is different and printed uniquely. They're all completely backpanned except for a small vision panel on the side. They are backlit with a colour change LED. There's provision to get in and change that material through the mullions. So a very, very significant piece of work here. And here's a view of it from the City Works depot. A particularly important characteristic for Sara and us, I think, about how that building will change in different light and weather. And it's interesting how often it leads to discussions about how grammable this is. These are questions that come into architecture discussions increasingly more. What's the Instagram moment? Is this the shareable view of the building? And it's amazing how often this now comes into conversations. The manufacture process involved a lot of testing. There's a lot of test panels here over in Singapore, playing with the translucency and the transparency of the glass and testing it under backlighting and skylighting. You see it here on a rig, kind of investigating what that level of translucency and transparency is. Some of those fins you see here in assembly over at Thermosash, they're clamped each side with a 200 by 10 flat each side. As you can imagine, there's fairly substantial wind loads on these. And on the right-hand side, you can see the little insert where the LED sits to edge light that panel. Full-size mock-ups are a really important part of getting this right, both to investigate assembly, weathering, sequencing, how different facade units and types come together, but also how to test the lighting and how that effect will work. There's investigations here about how to get the evenness along the back pan, how to tune those, and that tuning will continue to happen as they're installed to, if nothing else, comply with resource consent conditions and all sorts of other exciting things. A couple of weeks ago, the first of these pieces was installed on the 8th of February. They're now running all the way down that edge. After spending several years kind of telling the story of the building, we really are delighted to see it actually starting to speak for itself. And seeing Sara's work go in here is a really big moment. These are the sorts of images that make us very, very happy. On the left, we've got a very, very happy builder. On the right, we've got a very, very happy artist. These are things that delight us and make us very proud. To quickly talk about Peata's work on the spine wall, this idea of weight, it was used to how it could mark the laneway, which moves across down the right side of the page there and connects Hobson and Nelson Street. And also how it can contrast the lightness of Sara's work. The terracotta sits on this regular 250mm grid, so it basically presents like a weaving loom or a matrix on which you can investigate pattern making. And Peata really used the challenge of how her work could contrast Sara's to draw out further distinctions and play with this idea of weight and contrast. So she's talking here in a slide about comparing Sara's work as the piu-piu, Sara's work as the pare, the bodice, and her work as the piu-piu. And yet at the same time, she likes this idea of distortion and sees it as a natural idea. So on the right, this sort of idea that nature can bend and distort. This is just a pattern study she was doing during design, and you heard her speak in the video about how she was interested in softening and undulating the pattern. So she worked up a pattern that would read both at scale, but would also be something interesting and exciting to experience up close and at ground level. Investigating the colour and the process of confirming this on the tiles was another visit to the factory in Spain in the middle of 2017. Looking at the glazing and the firing processes, understanding how colour and texture move through those processes so that she could land on the final set of 8 colours. She's got 6 base colours in here and 2 accent colours, and a really wonderful kind of richness of texture in here, which was important for when we were up close to that piece of work. Mock-ups, as always, important, an 8x3 bay here to investigate how the joints appear, how the bracketry system works, how it sits over the cavity, and of course the appearance and scale and how these things move in different light. So, back to us, we throw together our drawings, we say where everything goes, we use fundamentally conventional drawing processes to do that. We can use a bit of 3D because that's a little easier nowadays. But what I really love about what Peata did to document her work is she actually made this massive Excel spreadsheet and listed out all 13,500 tiles in Excel, coding the profile type, the colour and the orientation, and itemised every single one of those to push into her shop drawing process. And here's a view of both of those works now, a view from the yet to be installed or soon to be installed air bridge, showing that contrast there. And just the same view again from Nelson Street. I think what's evident here is just the strength of those two pieces of work. These are two of the largest public pieces of art in New Zealand. There's this magnificent interplay of weight and lightness between them. And, you know, at the ground level in the laneway, as a view of how Peata's work will come to ground, there's a range of texture and colour and brightness and boldness that is very rarely seen in the CBD. We're hoping that to see Peata's work installed around the middle of the year. So while Sara's work is really starting to speak for itself, we're looking forward to Peata's work very shortly telling its own tale. Thank you very much.